there's enough incentive there to create a very, very strong chilling effect, right? This bill actually should not be passed in any form. Certain stakeholders, and we don't know who these are, have been given an updated version of the bill called the 2024 bill.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Now, on Thursday, August 1st, I found myself at about 5 p.m. creating this tweet where I asked people for support for independent journalism and content creation. That's because we are all hearing about a broadcasting regulations bill 2024 that is expected to be quite draconian and will be the death knell for a lot of these independent content creators and journalists, including yours truly, to understand what is at stake, what are the provisions in this bill. Remember, not too many people have seen this bill, and to find out what all of us can do in order to protect ourselves and safeguard ourselves from this imminent bill that may be introduced and will become law. I'm talking today to Prateek Waghre. He's the executive director of the Internet Freedom Foundation, and they've been spearheading a public information campaign against this bill. Prateek, thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me on.
What is at stake here? What is it? Because I don't think there's enough public discussion, Prateek, at this point.
No, you're right, and there isn't enough public discussion. Certainly, that's the sense we're getting. And I think what's at stake here is a lot, right? It's pretty much the ability for all of us, as as citizens of India, to be able to speak on the internet, to share on the internet, to express ourselves on the internet. Whether someone like yourself who's doing independent journalism on the internet, you're a content creator who relies on the internet and their followers for monetization, or broadly, if you're just someone who's even consuming information on the internet, this has the potential to affect affect everyone in the way that the broadcasting services regulation bill is so broad and so vague in the way it defines certain aspects and certain things that it wants to cover, right? And we can talk about some of them, but that was that was part of the idea, that to generate and create awareness around this and the effect that it could have on all of us as citizens of this country.
Now, I believe this is a draft that is an update on what was put out in November last year. So, why was the need for this update when we had a draft that was put out in November? And also, why is it that there seems to be so much secrecy? I believe not too many people have actually had access to read this, and it's definitely not in the public domain.
Yes, exactly, right. And look, and I think the idea with a democratic process, legislative process, is that you put out a first version of the bill for public consultation, you get feedback on it. Right now, that happened in the sense that in November last year, there was a version of the bill that was put out. People had time to give public comments, but unfortunately, what's also practice is that practice that we follow here is unfortunate, that once you've given your feedback, you don't actually know, those comments are then rarely ever made public, right? So you don't know what other people have said about the bill, who's representing public interest or not. You don't have the opportunity to engage, right, what is typically called as the counter comment phase, where you're actually be able to maybe rebut arguments that someone else is making with evidence, right? None of that has been consistently followed here, and you typically just go to the phase of the bill being introduced, and the ministry claiming that there was an extensive public consultation, but by any fair means, that's not the case. Now, what's happening here with the broadcasting bill is a step beyond, in the sense that as Aditi Agrawal of the Hindustan Times broke last week, that there is almost an opaque or secretive consultation process that seems to be happening, where certain stakeholders, and we don't know who these are, have been given an updated version of the bill called the 2024 bill, right, or the Broadcasting Service Regulation Bill 2024, with certain changes that seem like it expand the scope, or certainly don't address a lot of the concerns that civil society had raised
Raised in November last year.
with the November version of the bill, right? It doesn't, based on current public reporting about about the contents of the bill. It doesn't seem like many of those have been addressed, if any at all, and some potentially, confirming that, or confirming our worst fears about the intentions of this regulation.
Mm.
But
Mm.
the process as it stands today is that we don't know. There is no draft in the public domain, right?
Yeah.
And it's also been reported that the extent that's been gone to ensure that the draft is not circulated in terms of their, potentially being serial numbered and watermarked, etc., right? Which is also very concerning, right? That
Mm.
uh,
What is the
only are
reason
you
for the secrecy? Why so much
Ex- ex-
secrecy?
Exactly, right. That's concerning, right? Let's assume a couple of months later there actually is a draft that they managed to put out, right? A revised draft for a public consultation. Let's not rule out that possibility. But even when that happens, the questions I would still have is: look, who are these people who had this consultation, who were given this privileged access to an early version of the draft? What comments did they put in? How did the bill change, right? And that's just on procedure, right? But even broadly, uh, let's say there is another public draft. Our concerns with the first one still remain, right? And which is why we've been vocal about the fact that this bill actually should not be passed in any form in its current, as it currently seems to envision control over large aspects of the way people are able to speak and express themselves uh, on the internet, right? Which is why we've been, this uh, the hashtags of kill the bill and content bachao have been, are being used. But broadly, even if there is this process, right, that let's say some of the deficiencies in the process are addressed in the future, the contents of the bill are extremely problematic, and what people should also be concerned and opposing.
Yeah. So let's take a look at some of those provisions which are there in the November draft and that you have seen, and that you have, sort of you're concerned by, and take us through some of those because, like I said, it's just been what, 6 months since I started this independent journey via YouTube, and to think that I'm going to come up against all these provisions is very, very scary. But let's take one at a time. Where's the first one? What is the first thing that we should be concerned with?
Sure. I think the first, and this is sort of a meta point, but the first one is about the definitional ambiguity that there is, right, in terms of who actually comes under the bill, what type of activities come under the bill, right? Especially when you look at the fact that it also wants to cover, what in the previous version was called current affairs and news analysis, right? Which essentially just spoke about any new and noteworthy audio visual content, right, which seems to cover everything. And then reports suggest that definition has been further expanded to include textual commentary as well, right? Which means almost anything you're saying about current affairs or news, which is if you look at the fact that a lot of conversation on social media platforms tends to be real time, tends to be about current events, right? How do you draw that line? Where do you draw that line, right? If you're talking about a billionaire's wedding, does that qualify as a billionaire's progeny's wedding? Does that qualify as news or not? It's debatable, right? And I think so there is just this definitional ambiguity, right? Then there is this fact that, okay, if it's a systematic activity, it's covered by the bill, right? Now the previous version didn't actually define systematic activity. Now reports suggest that there has been some definition that's added. It's not clear to me what the specific wording is, but again, from what I've seen reported on it, it doesn't seem like it solves the definitional problem at all. It seems like you can cover anything, right? So whether you are a journalist who's running a YouTube channel, or if you're writing a newsletter on a subject of interest, doing analysis. And it's not just policy, right? And I think this is the point that needs to be stressed on, that just how broadly current affairs and news has been defined is that it can cover almost anything, right? And the problem that creates is that it then leaves that discretion, right, up to whoever is enforcing, or whoever is whoever is doing the implementation, to use that in any way, right? And that's the executive discretion part is, of course, is the challenge, right? Because the bill also, right, in addition to this, has obligations of requiring you to adhere to a program code or an advertising code. Right now, again, some of these things will be defined in the future, but for example, the current program code, or if you look at the one that applies to the most, has terms like morality and public decency in there, which we've seen being abused over the years, right? So as long as there is going to be similar language in there, it's going to be used very subjectively, very selectively, right? And then, for example, if you're a content creator, you also need to have, so basically, if as long as you're not doing live news, right? As long as you're not doing live, you're doing any form of curated content, right? And again, the definition from the reports of curated seems to be so broad that, let's say I'm an expert in the financial domain, right? And I read, and I compile, let's say, my knowledge over a period of time and put that out there. Is that considered curated? It could be, based on, based on what it's such a broad ambit, right? And then it imposes obligations on these folks, on these people, to have what are called content evaluation committees, right? To certify content. There is an obligation to be signed up with a self-regulatory organization, which then falls under an authority called the broadcast, essentially a broadcast authority, which has, all members nominated by the union government. Five will be ex officio. There'll be a chairperson and five eminent persons that they seem to, that they envision, but it's all nominated uh, by the union government. And then you couple this with the fact that there are penalties for a lot of this, right? So if you don't have, if you're not signed up with a self-regulatory organization, there's potential for a penalty on you, and the quantum varies based on the size that's envisioned, whether you're a major, micro, medium, and they've got some criteria there based on the investment and turnover, uh, to determine the quantum of punishment. But in many cases, it runs to several lakhs for different types of violation, or if you violate the program code, right, which we've not seen yet and we expect will be very vague. There is a cost per violation, and then that sort of compounds with subsequent violations. Right? So it's almost death by a thousand cuts, with this subjective enforcement possible.
What is the burden of compliance it'll put on platforms? So for instance, I'm operating now out of YouTube, right? I mean, that's where the channel is, that's where the content lies. What is the burden that this bill will put on the platforms and the distributors in that sense?
Yeah, so I think, so what we know of the 2024 version right now does say, it's a little mixed in that sense, that it places the primary burden on the creator themselves, but it does give the union government the powers to demand information from the intermediary. So it creates some obligations there, and essentially seems to then put in provisions for penal prosecution, naming the criminal code, uh, you know, uh, if they don't comply with instructions or instructions or requests for information that they receive, which again then significantly skews the calculation for a social media intermediary themselves, right? If they get a request to, let's say, to shut down a channel, right? Some of which is, of course, already possible under the IT rules, right? Which are under challenge, the parts that apply to news media, right? But it's essentially giving another way to issue instructions in that sense, or if they request for information about who operates the channel, etc., and things like that. Again, some of those obligations exist under different regulations today, but it seems like it's being now consolidated under the Ministry of Information Broadcasting, with this, right? And there's
And we saw in the new Council of Ministers, the MEITY and INB, both these ministries given to one minister,
yeah.
right? Ashwini Vaishnav to look after. So there is a desire for convergence between these two very separate ministries at this point of time, isn't it?
It does seem like the only thing I'll say about that is that can always change, right? That can always
Mm.
change in the
Yeah.
future with a different appointment. But I think it is certainly is some signal, in the
Mm.
sense that at least in the interim, that
Mm.
you have they're headed by the same minister, and
Mm.
and from my perspective, we're seeing the same uh, problematic kind of legislation coming through, that that leaves a lot of discretion and executive control, and are very concerning from a rights perspective.
Have you heard from the intermediaries? Is there a reaction yet publicly to what they are hearing? Because they will also have to sort of change and come up to scratch, isn't it, if new compliances are required out of them?
No, so look, publicly, not much. And again,
Mhm.
like I said, we don't know who the stakeholders, who
Who
the
were consulted are.
who the quote unquote privileged stakeholders are.
Yeah.
It's possible that some of them are already involved in these conversations, but there's none of them will be public
Hmm.
about it. And I think even historically, there's not been a trend for them to push back publicly. Now, what happens behind closed doors, to what extent they push back, remains unknown
Hmm.
in a lot of cases. But historically, publicly, there's generally not been a significant pushback, other than through industry bodies. Behind closed doors, they may be pushing back, they may be complying. That remains that
Or
remains.
they may be in court, or
uh,
they may be in court in some
in,
cases,
in,
right?
in rare cases where you had Twitter
Yeah, yeah,
go
that's
to
what I was
court,
referring to.
and there's also Facebook, when it was called Facebook, and
Yeah.
WhatsApp, who were in court, specifically, again, part of the IT rules about the
Hmm.
traceability provisions. But again, there the context for them there also is that with the IT rules 2021, right, the ones that were notified in February 2021, uh, there was also this obligation and potential of for liability of individual employees that was created, right, which again significantly shifts the calculus for companies who anyway tend to look at India as this big market that you don't necessarily want to lose access to, right? So it's already in my opinion, a skewed incentive to comply, right? Because you don't want to lose market access, and then you couple that with the potential employee safety uh, calculation, right? And the incentive for them to push back is actually is fairly low.
So what are some of the things that would start applying if this were to become law? For instance, if you were to just take if you were to take an illustration to make this point, I mean, you can take a look at what I am doing and say what are some of the things that I will have to start complying with if this bill becomes law.
Yeah, so I think this would fall. It's actually interesting, because in the news and current affairs, this thing, it looks like you will have. So, like I said earlier, there may not be the obligation of uh, the content evaluation committee, right? That applies, which other creators may have to do if you're not doing news content, and you're supposed to inform the union government who the members of this committee are. And in the previous version, you also had to make that public. Now reports suggest that you no longer have to uh, make it public. Um, Pretty much everyone has to be a part of this self-regulatory organization. Everyone has to have a grievance officer who has to respond to complaints, right? And
So for this little channel of 1,000 subscribers, if this bill were to be law, I would need a grievance officer.
you would need a grievance officer, and likely at some point there will be more rules around how soon you're supposed to respond to them, in what time frame you're supposed to respond to them, etc., right? And then if and someone is not happy with the complaint, they're able to go to they're supposed to go to the self-regulatory organization, which will then sort of look at it. You'll probably have to pay membership costs to a self-regulatory organization, because those also have to function, uh, right? And they can then issue instructions to you as a channel. Again, if someone is unhappy, they can further escalate that complaint to the broadcast authority itself, which may also then issue instructions. And this can vary. It can be a monetary. It can be. I think the previous version said it can be like a demand for a correction, an apology, penalties, etc., and and things like that, right? So and you also have to put this in the political economy context, right? That it then becomes very easy to sort of weaponize this complaint mechanism as well, right? Especially if you're doing independent journalism that can be critical.
Also, yeah, and Pratik, I think what it does is what I have experienced in the mainstream media, in large television broadcasters and in large television networks, a self censorship that had come into place. Because and there it was, sort of voluntary because of the ownership of such mainstream media. But here, I mean, if I know that this is what I might come up against, there may be so many kinds of conversations that I don't even bring to the table, though they do is further debate and build bridges in terms of an exchange of ideas, right? So how worried are you about the self censorship that something like this will end up creating?
No, that's a huge concern, right? Because I would say maybe some of the independent journalists may still try to brave it out.
Hmm.
One hopes,
Hmm.
but I think if you look at the more curated content, folks, certainly, right? I think there will be very little willingness on their part to engage on controversial subjects, and and things like that, right? And like I said, there's also this ability to enforce monetary penalties, right? So it doesn't have to be as drastic as shutting down people, right? It can just be repeated penalties and fines for various kinds of violations of whatever codes they envision, and however they're defined, or through complaints and things like that. So it doesn't have to actually go to the extent of ordering, shutdowns of channel, right? Just the threat of compliance and the threat of penalties, and in many cases, individual liability to prosecution as well, which seems to be there in both versions of the bill. That anyone who's involved with the operation and a director is going to be a director at any entity is going to be liable personally, right? In the sense that they can be prosecuted criminally. So that there's enough, there's enough incentive there to create a very, very strong chilling effect, right? For people just to say that, look, this is probably not worth the risk, right? Or if you're doing it, you're not going to say anything that's remotely controversial or critical, uh, which in many ways is possibly the intended outcome, right? That uh, it is this space where right now people do have the ability to engage and provide an alternative narrative to what you're seeing, especially on the broadcast media today,
The Internet Freedom Foundation, your organization is at the forefront of the public information campaign. You have intervened, and been, in courts. You'll have actually petitioned directly in different matters in the past when it comes to digital freedom and protecting digital liberties. Where do you see this go from here? Because until it comes into play in public, this bill is available for everybody in public. uh, what are we doing? What are we really doing, and what is the path ahead for this?
Yeah, no, look, and I would say it's not just the internet freedom foundation. I think it's been encouraging to see many people,
Sure.
many creators take up this bill and engage with the risks, and try to amplify that, right? And I think one, that conversation is important because
But are
ultimately,
these mostly people who are doing content that is from the domain of journalism or political opinion? Are you seeing other content creators also engage in this manner?
no, so I think it's early days. So it right now it is skewed to people who are politically aware and politically inclined. I think there is need to build that, build momentum there, build that constituency, get more people to be first to understand how it affects them, and talk about it, and then there's need for more broad based pushback, because again, historically we've seen that is one thing that potentially works, right? That if there is widespread pushback, right, and not just a few organizations, if there's widespread public anger and pushback against something, then sometimes there is pause to they sometimes reconsider something. We've seen that happen in certain cases where they've changed legislation, but sometimes they've pushed ahead as well, right? So it's a variable strategy, but I think broadly we need more people to be uh,
Sure.
firstly engaging.
Aware,
Uh,
aware.
yes, right, aware and aware and pushing back. I think it's
Hmm.
also important for for politicians to take this up.
Hmm.
It's been interesting to see some of the change in parliament.
Hmm.
Right now, again, this, not to say that this should go to parliament immediately. I think we're far away from that point. But if there's an ability to create pressure on the executive to put this out in the public domain and actually change course
Hmm.
in what seems to be the intent, right, of
Hmm.
curbing and chilling free expression and free speech. If there's pushback on that front, that's possible. That needs to happen, right? And then, of course, there is the fact that, look, once it comes to parliament, it should ideally go through a committee. This is an important legislation with significant implication. It should go through a neutral committee process, and we need to have all those things there, right? There is, of course, still the possibility that it may yet get passed as a problematic as a problematic piece of legislation, and in
And
that case,
that's when the courts come into the
and
picture.
and that's when the courts would come in, and I think this is an observation that I think that Nikhil Pava had made somewhere else, but I'm just sort of uh,
Hmm.
quoting there, and because I think it was pertinent, right? That and the point being that, look, sometimes it takes the government a few years to pass a bad law, but it takes civil society many more years to actually go through the process of challenging it in the courts and getting and actually succeeding there. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be there's potential for this to be a long struggle, but I think that's where we need civil society organizations, of course, like the Internet Freedom Foundation, many others who are also taking this up to continue pushing back. Just the broader aspect of more citizen and civic engagement from people, because I think that's where the strength really comes from in these movements and campaigns. It's not so much the individual organization; it's how many other uh, people engage with it, right? And then if it has to go to court, then I guess people will go to court.
Prateek, I think we'll keep talking because it's important, and I think it's really about survival for many of us going forward. So, thank you for all the information that you put out there and the stuff that you're doing to build a campaign out of this. And we'll keep talking. I guess everyone will join this conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for having me.